I was ankle-deep in dry, cracking soil when my crops started dying right in front of me, and that's not a metaphor. I mean actual rows of wilted squash and bone-dry tomato plants gasping under the blistering sun. That morning, I'd woken up to a bizarre gurgling sound in my irrigation shed and walked outside to find nothing but hissing air where gallons of pressurized water should have been roaring through the lines. At first, I thought it was a busted valve or maybe a buried pipe had cracked, but when I followed the system's buried trail across my boundary, what I found made my blood run cold and my jaw hit the dust. My irrigation system, the one I built and maintained for 10 years, had been hijacked. Not stolen, not accidentally tapped. No, it had been professionally rerouted with new pipe connections, shut-off valves, and even fancy landscaping to cover the theft. And the thief? HOA Karen, president of the local homeowners association, was out front of her house sipping iced tea while her newly installed backyard sprinkler danced over her roses. My water, my pressure, my system. It took everything in me not to march up and dump the entire hose on her designer flip-flop. I was furious, but also stunned. How did she even get access to the underground lines without causing a leak? I designed the system with redundancies and deep trenches. That's when I noticed something, a flag. A tiny neon pink flag with "Survey Line" written on it, the kind contractors use before digging. She hadn't done this on a whim. This was planned, measured, and executed like a military strike. And now my land was a casualty. I took a few photos, not that I needed proof, and stormed over to her with as much politeness as I could fake. "Karen," I said, already regretting using her name like we were on friendly terms. "You want to explain why your sprinklers are connected to my system?" She gave me that smile. You know the one. Tight-lipped, smug, the kind of smile that says she thinks she's won before the war's even begun. "Oh, I was wondering when you'd come by," she said with theatrical innocence. "The HOA decided to green up the common areas and, well, your irrigation lines were running through easement zones. We simply utilized them. For the greater good." "For the greater good?" I echoed, blinking. "You rerouted my system. That's theft." "Oh, don't be dramatic," she said, waving her hand like she was dismissing a bad Yelp review. "It's not theft. It's community sharing. Besides, I filed a permit." "A permit?" She really thought filing paperwork retroactively justified this? I called the city the moment I got back inside, only to find out the permit was for temporary landscape water sourcing for communal beautification. That's code for, "We're gonna steal your water and pretend it's temporary until we make it permanent." And the worst part? The inspector who signed off on it? Turns out he's her cousin. I wasn't just mad. I felt violated. This land was my retirement plan. The crops were my livelihood. And the water system? It was a labor of love. 10 years ago, I buried every pipe myself, connected every valve, and spent nights running pressure tests by flashlight. Karen didn't just tap into my plumbing, she dug into my memory, my time, my sweat. And now she was bragging about making the HOA bloom in her community newsletter. Over the next few days, I tried going through all the proper channels. I filed a complaint with the HOA board. They laughed me out of the meeting. I sent a letter to the city, only to be told the matter was under review. I even tried confronting the contractor she hired, a guy named Nick with a sunburn and a conscience that looked like it had gone missing a long time ago. All he said was, "I just followed the flags, man." The neighborhood started noticing too. Some of the older folks asked why my fields looked like a desert while Karen's lawn looked like a resort. A few even came to me privately and said, "We didn't know they were using your water." Apparently, Karen told everyone I volunteered to share my system as a gesture of goodwill. I nearly choked on my coffee when I heard that. She even put out a flyer titled Hydration Harmony, our community's new green era. I wasn't just losing water. I was losing the narrative. That's when I realized something chilling. While reviewing the original layout of my system, something I kept archived in my garage binder. I noticed that during a flood scare 3 years ago, I'd constructed a backup grid. A failover irrigation network that bypassed my main line and drew from a secondary well, just in case. I hadn't used it in years, but when I pulled up the blueprints, it hit me like a lightning bolt. Karen's team didn't tap my main line. They tapped the backup system. The one that ran deeper, was pressure-controlled, and most importantly, was on a private circuit I could control remotely from an app one hadn't opened in ages. I went into the app, tapped around, and sure enough, there it was. The HOA was siphoning water from the secondary system. A system I could throttle, redirect, or completely shut off without leaving my house. I stared at my phone for a long time. I could end her little oasis with a single swipe. But that would be too easy. No, I had something better in mind. Karen wanted to play water games? She had no idea who she just tapped into. The morning after discovering I still had control over the water supply, I sat on my porch with a cup of black coffee, staring out over the sun-scorched patch of dirt that used to be a vibrant, living garden. My mind wasn't on the crops anymore. It was on strategy. I wasn't going to yank the hose from Karen and spark an open war. No, this was chess now, and she had just taken a pawn thinking it was my king. But I still had the board, the timer, and every move from here on out would make her wish she'd never laid eyes on a PVC pipe. The first step was quiet observation. I had the app open constantly, watching the flow rates. Karen's side of the line was now pulling nearly 4 times more water than my original field ever needed, which meant not only was she watering her oversized lawn, but she'd somehow extended the system throughout the HOA's common areas. A drone flyover confirmed it. Sprinklers now dotted the central park, the tennis courts had their own misting system, and even the mailbox garden had a drip line installed. It was impressive, in the way a villain's lair always is. High-tech, sprawling, and entirely built on theft. That evening, I lowered the pressure by 15%. Just enough to make the sprinklers sputter a little, nothing dramatic. But within hours, Karen was on the HOA Facebook page posting a furious update about water inconsistencies and blaming the city's infrastructure. I almost felt bad for the municipal employees she tagged in the post. Almost. Then I took a walk near her house, pretending to be out for a stroll. What I found nearly made me burst out laughing. Karen had called in a private water engineer. He was kneeling next to her pump station with a laptop and a pressure gauge, clearly baffled that all his diagnostics showed everything was fine. She was fuming at him, gesturing wildly with a clipboard, demanding answers. I gave it 3 more days of slow pressure drop. Each time she escalated the issue more publicly. One morning she even called the local news. They showed up, did a short piece on the mystery water shortage plaguing our HOA, and Karen managed to make it through the interview without once mentioning the system wasn't even hers. She ended the clip with a dramatic line about doing what's best for the community, no matter the personal cost. The irony would have made Shakespeare weep. At this point, I figured I'd seen enough. She'd pushed herself into the spotlight, and I'd slowly squeezed her system to the point that the neighborhood's precious green spaces were beginning to turn patchy and yellow. But I wasn't done. If I was going to reclaim my water, I wanted everyone to know exactly how it had been stolen in the first place. So I compiled a digital timeline, screenshots of my original irrigation layout, timestamped server logs from the control app, side-by-side comparisons of water flow patterns before and after the theft, and high-resolution images from the drone flight showing the new connections Karen's team had installed. I attached it all to an anonymous email and sent it to every HOA resident, the local news outlet, and, just for fun, the city's Office of Public Resource Allocation. Within 24 hours, chaos erupted. The HOA group chat exploded with messages. People were stunned, some angry, others embarrassed for believing Karen's community-sharing lie. A few defended her, of course, claiming the system's origin didn't matter because the beautification had raised property values. But the ones who mattered? The older residents, the veterans who'd lived here for decades before Karen arrived, they were furious. One of them, a retired civil engineer named Ron, called a special emergency board meeting. And unlike before, this one was public. Karen tried to hold her ground during the meeting, swanning in with her usual power strut and polished HOA binder, but she looked less in control than usual. Her tan looked faded. Her voice cracked when she spoke. And when Ron laid out my full evidence packet, page by page on a projector screen, the silence was so thick you could hear the ceiling fan tick. She tried to argue the lines were on an easement, that the HOA was entitled to necessary public use. But then someone pointed out the system was never installed by the city and had been privately funded and maintained, with a documented history going back a full decade. Another resident, a lawyer, piped up that what she'd done could qualify as utility theft under state law. That changed the room. Karen's voice went up several octaves. She claimed I'd sabotaged the system to make her look bad, that I had intentionally cut water to the community to stir division. She even accused me of hacking my own app to falsify record. It was desperate and everyone saw it. The board voted to suspend her powers pending investigation, and just like that, the Queen of Sprinklers was dethroned. But I still wasn't satisfied. She'd publicly embarrassed me, drained my crops, and weaponized a stolen system to boost her image. I wasn't after petty revenge. I was after poetic justice. So I waited until midnight that night, opened my app, and ran a purge cycle, one that reversed pressure just enough to send a wave of air and sediment through the HOA's entire new system. No damage, just a mess. Sprinklers popped, brown water gushed into pristine flower beds, and timers all reset to midnight. The next morning, the entire community woke up to geysers in the park, a muddy tennis court, and a soggy Karen screaming into her phone while trying to stop water from flooding her patio. I watched from my truck with a thermos of coffee and a smile I didn't bother hiding. I hadn't shut it off completely. That would have made me the villain. No, I just gave them what they wanted, access to the system. I just forgot to mention it came with surprises. Later that day, I got an unexpected knock on the door. It was Ron. He looked tired but amused. He handed me a formal letter, an invitation to a special meeting to restructure the HOA's infrastructure management policies. In plain terms, they wanted me to take over the water systems entirely, legally, with pay. I played it cool, thanked him, and said I'd think about it. But inside, I was already planning my next move. I didn't just want to control the water. I wanted to flood Karen out of every ounce of power she still thought she had. And now, the pipes were finally mine again. The meeting to restructure the HOA's infrastructure was scheduled for the following week, but Karen wasn't going down without a fight. Even with her presidential powers suspended, she still had her loyalists, 2 board members and a handful of residents who either genuinely believed in her community vision or were too socially entangled with her to back away now. They started a smear campaign, accusing me of overreacting, of sabotaging a good thing, of being anti-community. Karen even distributed a glossy flyer door-to-door, with a photo of a dry park and the headline, "He cut off our water." It was laughable, especially because the sprinkler in that photo had been broken for months before any of this started. But perception matters, and she was doing her best to twist reality into a version that suited her. What she didn't count on was how badly things were going to backfire. The HOA email list, now flooded with replies from residents who were finally emboldened to speak up, turned into a digital courtroom. One resident shared a screenshot of her private texts with Karen, messages where Karen bragged about tapping into the farmer's system before he even noticed. Another forwarded an HOA group chat where Karen referred to me as the paranoid pipe guy and said I'd never dare to challenge the board's decisions. That quote alone sparked a new wave of fury. People started digging deeper. Someone posted old board meeting minutes showing how Karen had quietly diverted HOA funds for landscaping consulting, which turned out to be payments to her cousin, the same guy who signed off on the permit. Residents who had been indifferent before were now asking how deep the corruption went. Meanwhile, I kept my head down and played the long game. I didn't engage online. I didn't fire back. I let the truth do the damage for me, and it worked better than I could have hoped. By the time the meeting rolled around, there wasn't just a vote on water management. There was a motion to dissolve and re-elect the entire board. Karen showed up, of course, dressed like she was about to lead a parade, complete with a pearl necklace and a binder so thick it looked like it needed its own table. She tried to open the meeting with a speech, but Ron, who was now acting chair, interrupted and reminded her that her speaking privileges had been suspended until the motion was addressed. That didn't stop her from trying to hijack the discussion anyway. She shouted about community unity, about outsiders who never cared about the neighborhood until they wanted to sue it, and how she had sacrificed everything to bring beauty to the place. It was all theater. Loud, flailing theater. But the audience wasn't buying it anymore. The vote wasn't even close. The board was dissolved, Karen was permanently removed, and a new interim council was formed to oversee a transition period. Ron was officially appointed infrastructure chair, and after a brief deliberation, they asked me to oversee the irrigation systems. Not just my own, but a complete redesign of the HOA's water use. I accepted, but only under strict conditions. I demanded complete autonomy over the irrigation tech, budget approval power, and a written clause that allowed me to disconnect any unauthorized additions to the system. It was approved unanimously. Karen, now out of power and out of allies, started spiraling. She lodged a formal complaint to the city, alleging that I had manipulated infrastructure in a way that endangered the community's health. The complaint was dismissed within 3 days due to lack of merit and overwhelming contradicting evidence. Still, she didn't stop there. She hired a lawyer. I got a letter a few days later claiming I had intentionally created hostile environmental conditions and that Karen's backyard had suffered irreparable damage to ornamental flora. It was so absurd I actually laughed out loud. But I didn't ignore it. I handed everything over to my own attorney, a no-nonsense, high-powered local legend named Janet who had a particular distaste for HOA nonsense. Janet filed a counterclaim so thoroughly documented that it included water pressure logs, app control metadata, and financial losses related to my damaged crops from the theft. Within a week, Karen's lawyer quietly backed off. She'd picked the wrong person to try and intimidate. But just when I thought the storm had finally passed, something strange happened. I got a call from an unfamiliar number. It was a representative from a regional water rights organization. They'd seen the news piece and the ensuing online chaos and wanted to know more about my system. Not in a negative way, but with curiosity. Apparently, the setup I had built, especially the backup grid and the mobile control system, was something they'd been trying to implement in small communities across the state. They asked if I'd be interested in consulting on rural water infrastructure design. I couldn't believe it. What started as a turf war over sprinklers had somehow landed me a potential side career in water systems management. Karen, meanwhile, became the neighborhood ghost story. Kids whispered about how she used to control everything and now couldn't even get her hibiscus to bloom. She'd been reduced to a bitter jogger who passed by my house and scowled without saying a word. Her lawn? Still patchy and dry, because she refused to hook back into the new system on principle. Pride is a funny thing. It keeps some people from admitting defeat, even when they're already buried under it. I didn't celebrate openly. I didn't throw a party or hang a banner that said, "I told you so." I just went back to work, restoring my crops, strengthening the system, and making sure no one could ever tap into it without authorization again. I reinforced the lines, installed locking valve boxes, and even created a new fail-safe feature that would trigger an alert if pressure suddenly dropped beyond normal ranges. If anyone tried to steal from me again, they'd trip an alarm faster than they could say irrigation. But perhaps the most satisfying part of it all came a few weeks later. Ron dropped by again with a strange smile on his face. He handed me a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a metal plaque, custom engraved. It read, "Water Sovereignty Award in recognition of defending your land, your rights, and your pipes." It was a joke, sure. But it was also a sign of respect. I had gone from being the paranoid pipe guy to the one person the whole neighborhood trusted to keep the water flowing. And Karen? She lost her roses. I got my pressure back. Balance had been restored. 2 months passed and the neighborhood had transformed. With Karen gone, the HOA functioned like a real community organization for the first time in years. The petty fines stopped. The aesthetic violation, notices that used to show up like clockwork, disappeared. Residents actually attended meetings not out of fear, but out of curiosity and a desire to contribute. As for the irrigation system, I got to work designing something far better than anything Karen could have imagined, an intelligent, efficient, and secure network that adapted to seasonal rainfall, prioritized essential use, and could be managed remotely through an encrypted dashboard. For a man who once had to manually twist valves with a wrench in the dead of night, it was like stepping into the future. But just as I thought the chaos was behind us, the past came crawling back. This time with muddy shoes and an eviction notice. Karen, apparently unable to let go, had filed a lawsuit. Not just against me but against the HOA itself. Her claim? That she was wrongfully removed, that her reputation had been irreparably damaged, and that the new board was illegally formed. She claimed she had been slandered by a rogue farmer and manipulated by an unqualified board acting in conspiracy to defame and dismantle her community leadership. The language in the lawsuit was so exaggerated it could have doubled as a soap opera script. But the legal system doesn't care about how dramatic you sound, it cares about paperwork. And Karen, in her obsessive state, had hired a half-decent legal team. The HOA called an emergency meeting and invited me. Ron was already pacing when I arrived, holding a thick manila folder that looked like it had been handled by a dozen nervous hands. "We've got a problem," he said bluntly. "She's taking this to court. And she's naming you in her personal suit." I stared at the folder. My name was on the top, bold. I wasn't surprised, just disappointed. I'd hoped Karen would fade out with whatever grace she could cling to, but instead she was choosing to die on the hill of her own arrogance. I took the folder, flipped through the pages, and immediately spotted the holes. Her claim was built on the idea that she had the authority to reroute my irrigation system because of community easement access. But the water grid wasn't public. The land wasn't shared. The system had never been on HOA maps because it predated them by several years. More importantly, her own emails, the ones she had smugly sent to board members bragging about tapping into my system, were now part of public record. Still, I wasn't going to handle this alone. I called Janet, my attorney. She didn't flinch when I explained the new development. In fact, she sounded almost excited. "Let her try," Janet said. "We'll turn this around so fast she won't know what hit her. If she wants to drag her name through the mud, we'll make sure it's her own hose doing it." The court date was set for the following month, but that didn't stop Karen from stirring the pot in the meantime. She started walking the neighborhood daily again, telling people she was being persecuted and fighting for fairness. She told one resident that I had installed spy tech in the water system to control people's yards remotely. Another neighbor told me she claimed the new board was funneling HOA funds into a secret sprinkler cult. It would have been funny if it wasn't so embarrassing to watch a grown adult unravel like a ball of cheap yarn. When the court day arrived, Karen showed up in a bright red pantsuit, heels clacking like gunshots on the courthouse floor. She brought a stack of documents that looked impressive from a distance but crumbled under actual scrutiny. Her lawyer made a passionate opening statement, spinning a tale of betrayal, conspiracy, and character assassination. But then Janet stepped up, calm and composed, and laid down the facts like a machine. She presented the irrigation blueprints, the digital access logs, the footage from the drone flyover, and, most damning of all, Karen's own words in print from her HOA emails. When Janet read aloud Karen's line about reclaiming underused systems from people who don't understand community priorities, the courtroom went silent. The judge asked Karen's attorney how she could justify claiming ownership of a private utility system that had never been part of the HOA's infrastructure. He had no answer. It didn't take long. The judge ruled in our favor on every count. Karen's claims were dismissed as baseless, and she was ordered to pay legal fees. I didn't cheer, didn't gloat. I just thanked Janet and walked out with my head high and shoulders finally relaxed for the first time in weeks. But the story wasn't quite done. A few days later, as I was checking the system's diagnostics, I noticed something odd. One of the new public water lines had a minor pressure drop. Nothing major, but enough to warrant a check. I followed the pipe trail to a corner lot at the edge of the HOA boundary, an empty property that had been on sale for months. When I inspected the valve box there, I found a suspicious extension pipe running beneath the fence, toward the other side, toward Karen's house. She had secretly tried to hook into the system again, this time from outside HOA jurisdiction. The desperation was staggering. I documented everything, took photos, and notified the board. Ron was speechless. "She really thought we wouldn't catch this?" he asked, shaking his head. "What is she even hoping to achieve at this point?" I didn't say anything. I just walked to the control panel and shut off the valve. Permanently. I also set up a trigger alert. If any unauthorized pressure ever tried to push through that line again, the system would notify me and flood the pipe with air. Not damaging, just noisy. Enough to make sure no one ever tried that stunt again. The board decided not to press charges for the new incident. They figured Karen had embarrassed herself enough and didn't want to drag the community into more drama. But they did pass a formal bylaw. Any future tampering with utility systems would result in immediate expulsion from the HOA. Karen was warned. One more violation, and she'd be stripped of her membership. She'd lose her voting rights, her privileges, and any ability to ever serve in a leadership role again. I went home that night and sat on my porch as the sun dipped below the hills. My fields were green again, my systems were humming, and peace had finally returned. But I knew better than to think it would last forever. Karen was a storm that refused to die quietly. Still, now I had safeguards, allies, and experience. She could twist, scream, and dig trenches beneath fences all she wanted. I wasn't just the guy with the pipes anymore. I was the guy who made sure the water flowed, and who knew exactly how to shut it off. The final straw came not with a bang, but with a slow, seeping trail of wet footprints leading straight from the community park all the way to Karen's backyard fence. I wasn't even the one who discovered it. A kid named Marcus, maybe 10 or 11, flagged me down while I was working near the maintenance shed. "Hey, mister," he said, pointing behind him, "I think someone's been stealing the water again. It's leaking or something. My mom said to tell you." I followed him across the grass, half expecting it to be a broken sprinkler head or maybe a burst cap from the last rainstorm. But when I saw the long, winding track of water that shouldn't have been there, slipping under the fence line and disappearing behind Karen's property, my stomach sank. Not because I was surprised, but because I was tired. She just wouldn't stop. It had been nearly 6 weeks since the court ruling. The community had moved on. The new board was effective, the irrigation system was running efficiently, and even the residents who'd once backed Karen had gone quiet. She had vanished from meetings, from forums, from the sidewalks where she used to parade around like she owned the neighborhood. But clearly, she hadn't given up. This latest attempt to tap into the system was more discreet than before, but no less illegal. I followed the trail to a back utility access point where the system's overflow pipe was supposed to drain into a small gravel basin. Instead, someone had installed a hidden coupling, coated in dirt, almost perfectly camouflaged, but not quite enough to fool me. The line snaked out and down into a buried trench that ran, unmistakably, toward her house. This time, I didn't call the board. I didn't message Ron. I walked straight home, opened the control app, and triggered the new defense feature I'd built just for this scenario. A high-pressure air pulse shot through the unauthorized line, followed by a sudden spray of biodegradable dye. Nothing toxic, but brightly neon green and impossible to hide. Within minutes, I got a message from a neighbor. "Hey, Karen's yard just erupted in green foam. You gotta see this." I took my time strolling back. By the time I reached her house, half the neighborhood had already gathered out front. Her pristine flower beds were splattered in green, her hose was flailing like a snake on caffeine, and she was in the middle of the chaos, barefoot, drenched, and screaming into her phone. She saw me, froze, then dropped her phone in the grass. I didn't say a word. Just gave her a slow nod and turned to leave. That should have been it. The last act in a very long, ridiculous play. But Karen had one final card to play, one that even I didn't see coming. The very next morning, she called the local news. Again. Only this time, instead of spinning it as a community disaster, she claimed I had installed a booby trap and was assaulting residents with chemicals. The news anchor looked visibly skeptical, but they ran the segment anyway. Karen stood in front of her stained yard, holding a wilted flower and trying to look like a victim. The problem was, by this point, too many people knew the truth. Not only did the HOA provide the station with documentation of her tampering, but several residents submitted their own footage and statements. Marcus's mom even went on camera and said, "She's lucky he didn't press charges. After everything she's done, we should be thanking him for not shutting down the whole system out of spite." That news piece ended up being the nail in the coffin. Karen didn't just lose credibility, she became a punchline. Memes circulated. One had her standing in her flooded yard with the caption, "Live by the hose, die by the hose." Another showed her holding the dead flower under the words, "What are you doing, Karen?" I'd be lying if I said I didn't laugh. The HOA called a vote the following week. The motion was clear: permanent revocation of Karen's membership, with the stipulation that she either sell her house and move or accept permanent non-member status, meaning no say, no votes, no committee eligibility, and no further interactions with HOA operations. It passed with 92% approval. The few who abstained didn't even argue. They were just glad it was finally over. But I had one last thing to do. I walked over to her house, not to gloat, not to argue, but to hand her something. A small package wrapped in brown paper. She answered the door, cautious, wearing sunglasses despite it being evening. Her eyes darted between me and the package. "What's this?" she asked. I shrugged. "A parting gift," I said. "Thought you'd appreciate it." She took it, eyes narrowed. I turned and walked away. I never saw her open it, but I know she did. Inside was a miniature sprinkler head, one from the original system she stole. I had painted it gold and mounted it on a small wood base with an engraved plaque that read, "For services to Irrigation Comedy, retired." It wasn't mean. It wasn't cruel. It was a reminder. A quiet little monument to everything she tried, everything she lost, and everything she could have avoided if she'd just asked instead of taken. She moved out 3 weeks later. Rumor was she took a job in another state, somewhere with no HOA. The house was sold quickly, and the new owner, a calm, retired firefighter named Bill, greeted me with a 6-pack of beer and asked if I'd help him design a new garden layout. We laughed over the mess, shook hands, and toasted to green lawns and peaceful neighbors. Life returned to normal. Better than normal, actually. The irrigation system was thriving, the crops were back, and I found myself consulting with other communities who wanted to modernize their infrastructure without losing their sanity. It felt good. Like I'd earned something more than just water rights. I'd earned peace, and the respect of people who now knew that quiet doesn't mean weak, and kindness doesn't mean naive. So, if you're ever wondering what happens when someone steals your irrigation system and underestimates the guy with the calloused hands and a pressure gauge in his pocket, just remember this story. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't shutting off the water. It's making sure the whole world sees who really turned the valve in the first place.